Welcome to Stoughton Media Access Cable's Community Forum Show. My name is Steve Kelley and I'll be your host today. And today I have the absolute pleasure of bringing to you Miranda's Hearth, Miranda Aisling. All right, and Miranda is also the producer of the Tiny House Festival, which is coming to Stoughton September 23rd and 24th. So welcome to the show, Miranda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so this is great stuff, the Tiny House Festival. How did you become involved?
So I became involved for personal reasons. I built my own tiny house as a public art project about 2 years ago. And I first hosted the festival actually before I'd seen a tiny house because I was so passionate about them. I started digging for information and one thing snowballed into another and I ended up hosting a festival.
Wow. That's just like, without even owning one, you said, I'm going to host it.
Yes, yeah. Yep.
What part of it, what is the thing that drew you to it? I mean, this is a movement that is across the country. There are TV programs about it. What drew you in? What's the real hook for you?
So I think that's a great question. I think people find tiny houses for three reasons. They find them because they're passionate about environmentalism, because they're passionate about minimalism, or because they're passionate about economic security. And that was the last one for me, actually. Despite my story as an artist, despite all my community arts organizing, I'm very passionate about economic stability, and my housing is part of that. So my tiny house was the only way that I could see as a woman in my 20s with graduate school debt to own my own home, is to build it myself and build it tiny.
Wow. So tell me about minimalism, because you just touched upon it, but I'm not sure the audience knows. What does that mean?
It means a lot of different things to different people. I think in terms of the tiny house movement, it means really consciously considering what you own and why you own it. So it's about quality over quantity. For example, my door is a mahogany handmade door. I could afford that because I have one door in my entire house.
Wow.
Right? So you choose less items so that each item you have means more, has more significance, and is going to last for longer. There are other people who go down, there's the very, very high minimalism, which is kind of white-walled, as little as possible. There's a lot of spiritualness attached to that for some people. But for me, it really comes back to the idea of the less you have, the more that everything you have means.
Wow, what a like a soul-driven, dig deep kind of a principle that is.
Nice.
Own less, but make sure that what you do own holds value that's deeper than the surface. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very nice. So I'm going to ask Jeff. Jeff Pickett has been kind enough to come in and produce the show. Jeff, could you let the audience see Miranda's house? I think it's called Aubergine.
Yep.
And because we can get right into it, and the audience can have a quick look and say, well, what does that mean, the Aubergine house? So could you describe this for us, where it is, and a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this is where my house is currently parked. It's in a friend's backyard north of Boston by about 30 or 40 minutes. It's surrounded by gardens, which is beautiful. The woman who lets me park on her land is a very involved community activist. So she actually found me because she was interested in hosting somebody who had built their own tiny house. So it was a really amazing story for me of people wanting to give back, people wanting to support others moving forward. My house in particular wasn't built here. It was actually built, like I said, as a public art project because I'm a community artist. So what that means is I bring groups of people together to make things. In this case, I brought over 50 people together to build my house.
Wow. Now let's talk a little bit about Miranda's Hearth, and maybe we can get a couple of photos up from Jeff about the group in your Hearth setting. So what is Miranda's Hearth?
Miranda's Hearth is a nonprofit dedicated to building community through creativity that is approachable, affordable, and accessible.
So what is this photo that we have up?
Right now, it's a picture of our language exchange, which is a free event that happens in downtown Boston, which brings roughly about 15 people per month together to share the languages that they know and learn languages that they don't know.
Okay, and another photo. Oh, here we go. Beautiful. Jeff's reading my mind.
So this one is from our Makers Night, which also happens once a month. This one's at Artisans Asylum in Somerville, Massachusetts, and you can see the hearth that my mother painted in the background there. Yep, that's a painting based on the original hearth that I grew up with, which is brand new, so I'm very excited about it. But this is a Makers Night that comes together once a month to make things, to encourage people to bring out their creativity in whatever shape it takes.
Yeah, so don't just buy like commoditized things that are in stores. Make something.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And maybe we can jump back to that other photo. Mm-hmm. And what is this?
This is our annual picnic. It happens in Cambridge Commons in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it's part of our monthly potluck series. So this was actually the very first event that started this whole community for me back in July of 2013. Back then we called it a music, art, and wine night. And since then it's developed into a monthly potluck where people come together in a safe, creative environment, really just to share with each other. It's really a third space where people get to make things, meet people, and enjoy themselves.
And I'm wondering if that sort of the whole idea, if you're going to live in a tiny space, you also want to have outreach to bigger spaces with bigger people.
Absolutely. So there's a guy I used to work with at the Tumbleweed Tiny House Company named Art, and he described it really succinctly, which he said that it used to be everybody had their personal unit, which was their house, and they belonged to a village. Right, and so for entertainment, for exercise, for food, for community, for spirituality, they often went out into the village and had communal spaces where people could come together. In the past 150 years or so, we've shifted from having our personal units and being part of a broader community to bringing everything that's in the broader community into our house. Right, so now you have your own giant TV screen, you have your own coffee maker, you have your own exercise room, and you've turned your house into your own village that you never have to leave. And that's why the size has gone up, and in my opinion, and this is how the tiny house movement ties to the community art movement, it's also why loneliness has gone up desperately in America in that same generational cycle. Because we no longer go out, we no longer get connected to the people around us for the things that we need, because we have enough abundance that we can bring it all to ourselves.
And then people sort of withdraw into themselves and become lonely instead of outreach and finding other people's tie-ins with them.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people just don't know how to make the community engagement anymore. I mean, as somebody, I moved to Boston when I was 17, and I didn't know how you made friends. If you're outside of school, if you work part-time, I was a teacher at that point, so even when I was working, I spent all my time with children, not adults. So I didn't have coworkers, I didn't have classmates, and there wasn't something for me to plug into, because what it takes to build community is a consistent framework with a similar concept that draws all of the people together. So for example, at Miranda's Hearth, we have our monthly potluck, like I mentioned. It happens every second Sunday. And people know that on second Sundays, this has happened for 4 years, you can show up, you can sit down with people who care about building community through creativity. That's the common through line, right? These are people who care about actually engaging with other people. And so that consistency, and that both in terms of time and space and also in terms of concept, is what helps people unite, versus somebody that you walked into at the grocery store or somebody that you see at the office a couple of times. It's those spaces dedicated to consistent community building that are disappearing, in my opinion.
So that's a pretty succinct, nicely driven, consistent framework and a solid structure. Where did you learn that?
From doing it for 4 years. I do have a master's degree in community art, so I did go to graduate school to learn how to bring people together through the arts. But even that, it didn't talk quite at this level, and so that succinct message that you got is because I have been hosting events for 4 years outside of work, outside of my own personal art, to bring people together. And the reason for that is, like I said, I moved to Boston when I was 17 and I didn't know anybody. And I didn't know how to make any friends. I was also too young to go to bars, which is kind of the usual answer, like go out to bars and meet people.
Okay.
So I wanted to create the community that I wish I had walked into. And in order to do that, I did a lot of watching, I did a lot of experimenting to figure out what it takes to build a community. So at the beginning, these events happened whenever I had a free moment. And I realized that that meant that people didn't know when to expect them. They didn't know what to expect. So I realized that consistency is one of those first things. I learned that by watching the religious community. Churches meet every Sunday. And that expectation of people being there at the same time, you don't have to ask, you just know that your community is going to be there, is incredibly strong. The dance community, which I'm part of, has the same thing. There's a blues dance in Boston that happens every Thursday night. You don't need to ask people if they're going to show up. They're just going to show up because they like this dance and because that's the space, and that provides this framework to hold people.
How do you communicate that? In other words, so sure, you have a consistent framework. There's an old saying, something about if you don't advertise, it's as if you're in a room that's dark and no one can see it, or something like that. So how do you communicate to reach people?
A lot of it's word of mouth. Most of the core community members are people who I met when I first wrote my book, which is called Don't Make Art, Just Make Something.
Okay.
That was my...
So let me say that again. The name of your book is, and it's available.
It is available.
And it's called
Don't Make Art.
Just Make Something.
That's right.
Very good. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I'm glad we get to plug that a little. I'd like the audience to think about, don't worry about what you're trying to make as if it has to come out perfect. Make something, and then you can get some hints on what to do from Miranda.
That's right. That's right.
In the book. Good.
Yeah. So after I wrote that, I went to the streets and I sold it at street fairs. I sold it at holiday craft fairs. And as I was selling it, I met people. And the people who I met were people who were interested in that concept. And so they were people who were going to be interested in the events that I was hosting. So that book really led me to the events. It got me that core group of people. And since then, I have an active website, like you mentioned. We have our Facebook and our social media and everything. But the majority is people who you meet, who you talk to, who you say, oh, you really want to practice your Spanish before you go to Cuba, right? We have a free language exchange. You can come try that. And then at the language exchange, they meet somebody who reads with the book club every single month. And then they go to the book club. Or they meet somebody who's bringing a house to the Tiny House Festival, and then they show up at the festival. So I try and create a lot of different gateways for people to engage with this core concept of building a community through creativity.
How did you get your first venue?
My very first venue was my apartment.
Okay, so that was good.
Yep. But I realized that I wanted to go public so I could reach more people, and so that I stopped pissing off my landlady by hosting music, art, and wine nights above her head.
Yep.
So actually our very first venue was a wonderful place that we still use called the Democracy Center. It's
Wonderful.
in Harvard Square. And it's a nonprofit where if your mission lines up with their mission, you get to use their space at a donation base.
Right.
So they give you, the suggested donation for the room for the event. It's outrageously reasonable. And we've hosted our monthly potluck, apart from our picnic, which is in the park. And then we have a monthly waltz night with live music, and both of those happen in that space every month.
Wonderful. Mm-hmm. So let's draw the attention of the audience to the Tiny House Festival as a venue that you have created, and this year the third annual Tiny House Festival. And we have a little up on the page for you, the third annual Big Tiny House Festival, Saturday, September 23rd, 12 to 4 p.m. Now that is for a private showing, correct? So what happens at the private showing?
So it's a pre-festival day, and the reason that we did that is because in the two festivals before this, we've had lines that were over an hour long to get into tiny houses.
Okay.
Because as you can imagine, not many people can fit in a tiny house at a time.
Right.
So we started the pre-festival day so that we could do ticketed tours, which helps us raise money to pay people to bring their houses here, pay for the transportation.
Maybe we could show a couple of houses while Miranda's talking too.
Sure.
That would be nice. But go ahead, so continue.
Yeah, so the tickets help pay for the cost of the festival and all of the administration and for bringing the houses here. But it also means that people buy for specific time slots, and they show up at their time slot, and there are only 20 or 30 other people who showed up at that time slot, so they get to tour every single house, talk to every single builder without a line.
And so you'll have a few builders there. If anyone's interested, they can arrange to have a house built for them.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've got a couple different people who are coming.
Maybe you could just tell us about this. What is this? The inside of a house, of a tiny house.
Yes, this is Ashley Fazio's Destiny Dweller, which she's bringing for the first time this year, which I'm very excited about. Deke Diedrichsen, who's our local tiny house expert, put me in touch with her, actually, after he did a tour of her house. So this shows a pretty standard tiny house layout. You're looking in, I haven't actually been in this house, but it's pretty similar to my own. She's got a ladder leading up into a loft. Often the bed is in a loft space above either the kitchen or the bathroom or both. And then in the back, it looks like she's got a kitchen on her right and a bathroom on the left. So they're set up so that there's everything you need in this small space.
Now, your house is at a friend's house with a garden setting.
Yep.
And what about power, and what about water, and what about waste? Tell me about that.
So people use it all differently. For my house personally, the water comes in through a hose just coming from the side of her house.
Okay.
I've got a 35-gallon water tank in my house and then a gray water tank outside. So that handles the water system. An important note is that the water system is only for the sink and the shower because the toilet runs off of a composting system. So you don't have what we call black water, which is sewage water. And that's what gets really dangerous. Gray water isn't really dangerous because it's really just dirty water, right? Like you washed your car.
Okay.
The composting toilet is part of what makes tiny houses able to be so small and off-grid. There are tiny houses with regular plumbing, but the composting toilet is something that's actually much more sustainable in the long run, particularly as you look at so many parts of our world that's having droughts or water issues. Look at the entire west coast of the country. And so the composting toilet is a completely self-sustained unit that you just empty out.
Is it hard to do?
It's not hard to do.
No?
No. It's kind of like emptying a cage for an animal. You know, like I used to have ferrets when I was a kid, or a hamster cage. So it's quite simple, actually, and it's one of the easiest ways to deal with human waste. And I actually think I wasn't passionate about this from the beginning. I didn't get into tiny houses as an environmentalist. There are people who get into them for that reason. But the more I learn about composting toilets and low water houses in general, the more sense it makes. You know, we create all of this really toxic material because we turn it into sewage water rather than just letting human waste remain as dirt and water like it is with any other animal.
We go back to our nature, if you would,
Absolutely, So to answer your last question, the electricity in my house is very minimal. The electricity really just supports the lights and the outlets. I actually have electric heat, which is pretty rare. I have radiant floor heating in the bottom of the floor and then one single low energy wall heater. And that's enough. That got me through the entire winter. But people also sometimes have propane heat. People generally have wood stoves. I think Ashley's house has you can see a big pipe on the outside from her wood stove. So some people with those additions go completely off-grid, which means they have wood stoves, propane, solar. I believe Ashley's house is one of those. I know we've got a couple others coming that are in that category, and those are people who are doing it for the environmentalist reasons, right? They're trying to minimize their impact as much as possible.
So all of this points us to zoning.
Yep.
What are the zoning problems that a tiny house person would run into or have to handle as a challenge?
So the hardest thing for zoning actually is that it changes from town to town to town, which also makes it hard to answer this question, right?
Yeah, I don't think Stoughton, our host town, right, Stoughton Media Access Cable, I don't think we have any provisions set up yet, which it's my hope that having the festival here will sort of agitate the discussion and try to get some sort of a parameter around this for to have successful tiny houses. But what do you think? So tell me about that.
So there's some really great moves being made all across the nation. There was a group of tiny house experts recently that went to a meeting in Kansas City, I think it was last spring, of the International Building Committee, who set the international building codes. And that's kind of the arcing top level. And so they wanted to change it from the top. which I think is a great place to start, especially while other people are working to change it from the bottom, and then you meet in the middle, and hopefully you're good. So they worked to make a provision where you could legally build tiny houses specifically on foundations. Now here we get to the reason that a lot of tiny houses are built on trailers, is that the biggest obstruction for tiny houses is that there's usually a minimum square footage for a house to be legally built. What I've found is that it's difficult to exactly find this minimum square footage, because it's not like you walk into the zoning office and they say your house has to be 1,000 square feet. Right. They say that the bathroom needs this much square footage, the kitchen needs this much square footage, each person needs to have this much individual square footage.
Kind of arbitrary sounding, though.
Exactly. So you add it all together. And now I don't want to make it sound, I mean, zoning is there for good reason. There's a lot of safety behind it. There's a lot of, some of the original zonings, particularly for high density areas, were started during the Industrial Revolution, when you had 20 people, often immigrants, living in an apartment together, working really, really low wage jobs, just crammed in together. And it was
affecting
completely
the infrastructure
unsafe.
too.
Yeah.
So that, and that's an important reason why towns want to have some government over that, some oversight rather.
Yeah, so zoning is really important. I think in a lot of places it's gone too far, because zoning can also be used to control the aesthetic of a town, right? We don't want anybody living here in a smaller than 1,000 square feet. There are towns who have gone to the extreme to set that limit, so that you cannot build even medium-sized houses, because it brings down the property value of all the surrounding houses. So there's, in my opinion, there's zoning that comes from good reasons and it comes from bad reasons, just like anything else out there in the world. And tiny houses are pushing at those reasons and finding out the ones, okay, this is important because we need safe egresses, we need safe fire security for all of our homes. But this one seems a little arbitrary, and maybe it came in because there was a lobbyer who wanted really big houses. Or maybe it came in because the cost of construction went down, so you could build houses for less and sell them for more and get a bigger profit, right?
Well, there's a real fear of letting tiny houses in and creating mini trailer parks. So what about that? I mean, that seems to me a legitimate caution from somebody that has their property and doesn't want a trailer park next door. So how do you talk about the difference between a trailer and a tiny house with this minimalist environmentalist thing? So what's the difference?
So I think in that question in particular, you can separate out into two questions. There's the literal physical difference between a tiny house and an RV, and then there's the community stigma attached to trailer parks, which has evolved over the kind of the community era and the people we associate who live there, for better or for worse. I'm going to start with the first because it's easier.
Okay.
So the difference between a tiny house and an RV is generally the quality of materials. My house is a stick-built construction house with 2x4, spray foam insulation, wooden siding, and it's going to last, hopefully, for decades. It was built to last. It's built to last me through the winter, and it's built to look good, over time. It has an aesthetic to it. And I don't mean look good just in terms of the actual architectural quality, but I mean the quality of materials, right? RVs are usually made for temporary usage. And if you ever use something for its unintended use, it doesn't hold up very well.
So for vacationing, for instance.
Exactly. So RVs, camper trailers, they're great for that. They're often built by, from my understanding, not being an RV manufacturer, having kind of a steel frame and then just putting really thin metal or plastic walls on the side of them and stapling them to the steel frame. So think about the difference of that construction from a 2x4 wooden construction with insulation. Right, so they're much safer to live in year-round, especially if you're in New England and it gets very cold. They also last longer, and that's part of that aesthetic conversation that tips us into the second part of that question. And I think another part of it for me is that a lot of tiny houses, it's something that people come to from a choice. I've read some interesting articles about people who live in very small spaces and hate it. And you can't help but hate a space that you're forced into without your choice, right? So if you're living in an RV because you have no other place to live, it's probably not as ideal to you as my tiny house is to me, because I built it, I designed it, I put my love and my effort into it.
And you mentioned earlier about making the things that you put in there special and not trying to have more things, just very special things that you do.
Exactly. So I think there's an intentionality to tiny houses that I don't often find in RVs. And it's that exactly what you mentioned. It's I want to build this, I want to have these level of things in it, I want to live in this specific way, and that's why I'm doing it. I'm not being forced into a way of life, whether it's because of economic hardships or familial hardships or whatever you want to throw into it. And I think that's a really big difference, both in terms of the actual quality of the houses, but also in the people and the communities that grow out of them. The tiny house communities that I've seen are these really beautiful groups of people coming together to consciously figure out how to make their lives work in the world in a more sustainable way, in a more intentional and authentic way. So that stigma you see associated with RVs and RV parks, which there's a whole conversation about whether that stigma is deserved, because there's also the poverty and class line there. But I think that's not a fear that you should have from tiny houses. Tiny houses are going to look like cute gingerbread houses from 1800s English countrysides, right?
So
That's
it's a
what
village.
It looks like. It's a village.
Right. Well,
yeah.
our time is coming to a close. We're going to have September 23rd and 24th
Absolutely.
at Trackside Plaza at the train station, 2 Canton Street.
Yeah.
Right? And it's Saturday, would be 12 to 4, the 23rd, and you can come down and have a ticketed entry. I'm very interested. Approximate cost on the tickets?
$35.
$35. And on Sundays, open to the public. Everybody can come down. You'll get to travel through some of the houses. You get to ask questions of the people who actually live there. These are lived-in houses being brought in. I think you have 12 of them.
12
to bring in
yep.
for everybody in the surrounding area to have a good look, right? What sort of thing did we miss here as we wind down?
Well, other elements at the festival is that we're going to have music running throughout the day. We'll have tiny house experts giving talks.
Yes.
We're going to have a school bus, which is turned into a house coming in.
Unique. Wow.
Right. We're having the reused box truck that our local expert, Deke Diedrichsen, has just finished.
Okay.
We also have 12 vendors who talk about solar power, upcycled clothing, and a lot of other sustainability-based businesses along that line.
Well, Miranda, thank you so much for coming in. I'm so looking forward to this. I just can't wait to get inside. And I want to thank the audience for watching, and I want to thank Jeff Pickett out in the back for doing the camera work. So thanks very much.
Thank you.